First, let's see a CNN report about Curveball, who is living in Karlsruhe, not far from our place. It's just about 30 kilometers from here.
We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels. The source was an eyewitness, an Iraqi chemical engineer who supervised one of these facilities.
That source came to be known as Curveball. His real name, Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabi. Now he tells the British newspaper The Guardian he made everything up.
Were all those things lies?
Yes.
Al-Janabi, who also gave an on-camera interview to The Guardian, was asked why he sold a complete fabrication to German intelligence.
I had to do something for my country, so I did this and I am satisfied, because there is no dictator in Iraq anymore.
But a journalist who's reported on Curveball's credibility problems says that too is a lie. I'm speaking with Bob Drogan from the LA Times. His newspaper broke this story, and Bob wrote a book on Curveball in 2007. He's joining us on the phone from Cairo. Bob, why did Curveball tell this story in the first place?
He told the story because he wanted to get out of a refugee camp in Germany. He wanted to get on the payroll of the German intelligence agency. He wanted to get his wife out and bring them to Germany, and he wanted to get citizenship, and he wanted a Mercedes-Benz, and he got all of those things.
According to intelligence sources, Curveball told the German intelligence agency before the war that Saddam Hussein had a secret biological weapons program. The Germans had reservations about his credibility. They never granted the CIA direct access to Curveball.
I asked the chief of the German station here in Washington. He said, no, we're not going to give you access to it. And don't ask. It'll cause too much trouble.
But the analysis of Curveball's information did make its way through U.S. intelligence. There were tense internal debates over its credibility. Enough analysts thought it plausible that it made its way into Colin Powell's speech at the UN and became a key component of the Bush administration's case for a war that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. And the key players in this drama still feel the sting of all this. Responding to Curveball's admission that he lied, former Secretary of State Colin Powell sent us a statement saying it's been known for years that Curveball was unreliable, but that we should ask the CIA and other agencies why that wasn't put in their intelligence estimates before those estimates were sent to him and President Bush. George Tenet, CIA director at the time, says concerns about Curveball didn't get disseminated far and wide through the agency as they should have been, and that he wasn't alerted to those concerns. President Bush's office would not comment. We did not hear back from Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld's offices, or from the German intelligence agency. Candy?
And Brian, you've been you picked up more on what Curveball's been doing and more recently, which makes his credibility erode even more than it already is.
We sure did. Curveball went back to Iraq. He tried to run for parliament, but he was branded non-credible by other politicians there. He is now back in Germany. Bob Drogan, that author, says he's had a series of jobs at places like fast food restaurants, but he's gotten fired from those places for lying.
One has to understand that the German BND and many Germans are secretly very anti-American. The reason is easily understood. When the United States entered World War I and World War II, Germany was to be losing the war. In Germany you constantly have anti-American propaganda secretly being done by the snitchers of the state. Of course this is seldom done openly, but it allows to understand the following statements.
The first is, one of the things that I think really comes through in the book for me is the degree to which cooperation with foreign intelligence agencies, in this case specifically with the Germans, can be really quite difficult and fraught with peril if one isn't careful. And there seems to be a lot of indications that some of the earlier evidence that we had about Iran's programs, this sort of laptop of death, came to us via the Germans. And so if you have sort of general thoughts on the German intelligence services as a source of foreign cooperation and what that might tell us about Iran, that would be one thing.
Sure. One of the things I became fascinated on and here was the degree of suspicion and distrust between the U.S. and the German intelligence services. And there was a real sense through the 1990s that relations were nosediving between these two agencies. They were expelling CIA officers from Germany. We were wiretapping, eavesdropping in the embassy, got caught at that. There was just sort of this sniping back and forth of stuff. So there's this bad blood that goes between those two agencies to start with. Secondly, just sort of the nature of intelligence. So that was part of what was at issue here when they got Curveball and they said, we've got a really important source. Secondly, on a more sort of human level, the man who was then the head, he's now actually head of the BND, but then he had a different position as sort of a cabinet level officer in charge of intelligence and law enforcement, had been the former chief of police in Hamburg. He'd been a law enforcement officer, then intelligence, but he'd been, most recent job was chief of police in Hamburg. And he angrily, bitterly resented the allegations that came out of the Bush administration about the Hamburg cell after 9/11. We all remember that there was quite a lot of reporting being done about the fact that 3 of the 4 pilots of the planes had lived in Hamburg, and it was the Hamburg cell. And
the BND not only knew that Curveball was lying, but they even exaggerated Curveball's statements by adding useful information.
The British blamed the German authorities for mistranslating information that they were passing on and giving them false information that hyped the level of the threat. In particular, one of the things that made his information seem so dramatically raised its profile was this claim that they had put spray dryers on these trucks. That is, this ability to take a wet, slurry, gloppy, biological, soupy stuff and instead turn it into the stuff of like an asthma inhaler. So you get these clouds, and it obviously changes the nature of the threat. With this stuff, you can spray it out of airplanes or whatever, and it changed the nature of the threat. And they basically said that was just a misinterpretation or a mischaracterization of what it was, in fact, Curveball had said. But that wound up being in Colin Powell's speech, and it was very much in the British calculations before they were going to war.
Now let's see how Curveball's lies were delivered to the United States.
The CIA was having their own battle back and forth between the DO side and the DI side as to who was to blame on that. But by and large, they at least publicly blamed the Germans for not making Curveball available, which was always a dodge on their part. And the Rob Silberman Commission and the Senate Intelligence Committee more broadly blamed utter failure of management and utter failure of leadership, poor tradecraft, and they particularly all pointed the finger at something called the Defense Human Agency, which is part of the DIA, and which was sort of the front line. This was the group that was in Munich and was sort of the liaison between the BND and the CIA. And they had, what one of the investigators told me was a case of immaculate reception. That is, they took these German reports and they did no independent verification. They didn't do any vetting. They just put them up through channels, but because it was coming out from them, it seemed to have the imprimatur that this was reliable information. So by the time it gets up to CIA, to people like John McLaughlin looking at it, he's saying, well, obviously they must have checked this stuff, or why would it be landing on my desk? And in fact, it had never been done so. And the Rob Silberman pointed the finger for that at the Defense Human crowd. So there's sort of a lot of, he did it.
It is well known that the United States have little possibilities to verify information by own spies. They mostly rely on technical surveillance. The BND, of course, knew that information fed to the liaison office in Munich was accepted at face value and passed on without the CIA even having the possibility to verify it. And the CIA's demand to talk to Curveball was denied. There are reports of silencing the other opinion within the CIA. This, of course, is one of the biggest mistakes that can be done during the evaluation of information.
But one of the things that's fascinating is a couple of characters in there who, one in particular, who's still out at sea, he's now at the Counterterrorism Center, a man named Jerry, who had been one of the great proponents of Curveball's story within the CIA, within WinPAC. He was a self-described true believer, and at a certain point in the post-war investigation, when he became absolutely convinced that in fact the story was based on quicksand, that it had entirely fallen apart. They'd talked to the family, to Curveball's family, they had dug up records, they had interrogated all of the people in the chain of command who might know something about this. They had utterly disproved the story. he has virtually a nervous breakdown in Iraq and comes back to Washington, and he's determined to bring truth to power. And they treat him as if he has, a loathsome disease. He goes to work and discovers somebody else is sitting at his desk, and he's been reassigned to the visitor center. Sort of a subtle jab, right? Without access to a classified computer. The Soviets, of course, would send their people off to to psychiatric camps, so to speak. He was told to seek, in this case, he was told to seek counseling, that he needed therapy for his problems. When David Kay, many of you know, when David Kay, after he came back with a similar sort of, road to Damascus change of heart in December of 2003, prior to that, he'd had an office down the hall from George Tenet and a parking place in the VIP slot out in front of the CIA executive office building. When he came back this time, and again is basically saying, hey, we've got 85% of the information is done. We've pretty much destroyed this. We need to deal with this now. His office has been moved on another floor down the end of a hall filled with construction material. He's the only guy down there. No telephone. He doesn't get interviewed. He doesn't get invited to any meetings. He doesn't, get anything. And his parking place, instead of being out in the VIP section, it's at the far end of a parking lot that, the way he described it to me, was like Valley Forge. He had to sort of trudge across this mile of snow. In the end, the CIA finally was given access to Curveball in March of 2004, 1 year after the invasion. It didn't take very long. They concluded he was indeed a fabricator.
Still, the United States relied on the BND, which led to the biggest US intelligence failure ever.
All the post-war investigations concluded that without Curveball's information, they really had no case to make. Certainly not anything like the case they made, that Saddam had biological weapons. They had a very mixed bag of a hodgepodge of other defectors, all of whom subsequently also proved to be fabricators. But it didn't add up, and it sort of didn't jibe. He was the defining person. He was the eyewitness that the president quoted and Colin Powell quoted. I view this as, the worst intelligence failure in our history. I mean, there are lots of them out there, but I can't think of another one where we have, sacrificed so much blood, treasure, and credibility on chasing what really proved to be a delusion.
And this is very much to the pleasure of the German BND, as we can see from Curveball's whip treatment continuing long after he was proven and had admitted himself that he had lied. Remarkable is the amusement of the audience when Bob Drogan mentions that Curveball has a lawyer. Germany, being a totalitarian dictatorship of the administration, seems to be well known in certain circles. To my knowledge, no one being persecuted by the BND ever is able to find a lawyer. Except, of course, when the administration decided in advance that he will lose the case.
He lives in southern Germany. He's married. He has a son. He has a lawyer. He is under the protection of the German intelligence services. He has not spoken to members of the press. He is he's in the equivalent of a defector. He's in a defector protection program. It's the equivalent of a witness protection program. They have not made him available, nor have they chucked him out of the program.